The rain had just stopped in Cedar Falls, Mississippi, but the church windows still glittered with droplets, scattering light across polished pews and faded hymnals. Grace Taylor stood motionless at the altar, hands trembling beneath a bouquet of wilting lilies, her white dress a borrowed remnant of a life she'd never chosen. She was 23, her heart pounding like a trapped bird, and she was marrying a man more than twice her age, a stranger named Leonard J. Morgan, whose life and secret stretched longer than the river that divided this quiet southern town. No one clapped. There were no smiles, no whispered congratulations, only eyes filled with questions and lips pursed tight against rumors that had already begun to rot. All her life, Grace had been told that good daughters do not question fate. Now, under the heavy gaze of her mother and the silent command of her father, she watched as Leonard, dark-skinned, stoop-shouldered, with hair silvered at the temples, stood beside her, in a suit so plain it seemed to reject the occasion itself. He did not take her hand. He did not glance her way. The only words he offered were the ones required to seal a deal. "I do." The whispers rippled behind her like a poisoned stories of debts unpaid, of a family desperate enough to barter their only child. She heard a woman's hiss, might as well be selling her for land. Another softer. "He fought overseas, I think. Or maybe it was prison. Nobody knows." When the pastor asked if she would take Leonard as her husband, Grace hesitated. Her mother's eyes pleaded from the front pew, red-rimmed, already mourning the daughter she could not save. "I do," Grace answered, voice barely louder than the patter of rain on stained glass. She felt the world narrow around her, the air thick and still, and the vows fell between them like stones into deep water, heavy, irreversible. There was no dancing that night, no celebration. After the final hymn faded, only the rustle of papers remained as a lawyer slipped a signed contract behind the altar. A contract that had more to do with property lines and bank ledgers than love. Grace rode home beside Leonard in silence, watching the narrow streets of Cedar Falls slip past, slick with fresh rain. The car turned onto a lonely lane bordered by cypress trees, leading to a weather-beaten house at the town's edge, a house she now belonged to in name, if not in spirit. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of old tobacco. Grace paused in the dim hallway, suitcase in hand, listening for any sign of kindness or invitation from her new husband. But Leonard did not wait in the kitchen, nor did he open the door to their shared room. Instead, when Grace entered, she found him seated in a straight-back chair beside the window, his silhouette framed by the golden halo of a single lamp. On the pillow rested two objects, a small iron key attached to a brittle leather tag, and a leather-bound journal so battered it seemed ready to fall apart in her hands. Grace's breath caught. "What's this?" she asked, voice so small it nearly disappeared into the hush of the house. Leonard did not look up. His voice, when it came, was steady, low, and final. "This is the only explanation you'll get. Read the journal. If you want out after that, I'll sign the papers. But if you understand tomorrow, you'll know this marriage was meant for something more than debts." He stood, every movement slow and deliberate, and left her alone, the door closing with a soft click that sounded to Grace like a verdict. She sat on the edge of the bed, the journal heavy in her lap, the key cold in her palm. The rain had begun again, drumming against the roof and whispering secrets into the night. Outside, the town settled back into silence. But inside the house, Grace's world had shifted, her future, tangled with mysteries she never asked to inherit. Her wedding night passed not in the warmth of a new home, but with the chill of questions, the burden of a story waiting to be uncovered, and the first glimmers of a legacy that demanded more than silent suffering. As midnight passed and sleep refused, her Grace opened the battered journal to the first page, heart pounding, her life already changed by a single key, and the promise of all that remained locked behind it. The morning after her wedding, Grace Taylor awoke, not to the warmth of an embrace or the soft hush of a husband's greeting, but to a brittle silence so sharp it seemed to slice through the walls of the old Morgan house. A pale sun struggled through the warped window panes, and somewhere beyond the clapboard siding, the town of Cedar Falls was already awake, unaware, or perhaps all too aware, of the newly forged chain binding Grace to a man she'd never chosen. She lay there for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling, the weight of the journal and the small iron key pressing into her chest like a warning from another world. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb the stillness, though she suspected nothing she did would ever rouse Leonard J. Morgan unless he wished it. The house itself seemed built for secrets. Its floorboards creaked in odd places, and its walls had a way of swallowing voices whole. Every step Grace took echoed her own uncertainty. She drifted to the kitchen where a pot of coffee sat untouched cold as the look Leonard had given her the night before. He was nowhere to be seen, just the sound of the distant radio, a newsman talking about heat warnings and traffic accidents as if nothing in Cedar Falls had changed. But Grace's world had tilted. She poured herself a cup of bitter black coffee and returned to the parlor where the battered journal waited. Its leather was worn smooth in places, and the scent of old paper dust and something faintly floral, perhaps a pressed flower hidden between the pages long ago, greeted her as she opened it again. The first page, written in Leonard's precise, determined script, was more daunting now than it had been last night. She forced herself to read on. The further she went, the more the town's facade unraveled. Names she recognized from local street signs, Marshall Lewis Hurst, cropped up again and again in Leonard's chronicles. Disappearances, cover-ups, threats, all carefully cataloged with dates, addresses, and details so vivid they seemed to leap off the page. She read about Elise Warren, last seen leaving church in 1986, and Thomas Barnes, a factory worker whose accidental fall had been ruled suspicious by some, ignored by most. A thread of quiet rage ran through Leonard's notes, but so too did sorrow, small asides about grieving mothers, and sisters' lines about hope and disappointment, written in a different, more hurried hand. Grace's fingers traced a name that stopped her cold. Samuel Taylor, her father. The man who had once held her aloft on his shoulders, who had read her stories at bedtime, who had told her with pride that in Cedar Falls a person's word meant everything. She had believed in him until she saw his name beneath the heading Testimony in Defense Cover-Up at Willow Street. According to Leonard's account, Samuel had stood before the town council in 1997 and vouched for the innocence of men accused of something unspeakable. Evidence had disappeared. No charges were filed. The file's final line in Leonard's unmistakable hand read simply, "Who will tell his daughter the truth?" She pressed the journal shut, hands trembling. A dull ache started behind her eyes. She could hear the world outside continuing as always, the rumble of a garbage truck, the faint yells of children on their way to school, the constant low hum of the town. Her phone buzzed on the side table, and with a kind of numb dread, she picked it up. Messages from old classmates and acquaintances, stacked on top of one another, most short, some cruel, none comforting. One read, "Did your daddy really sell you to the old man?" Another, "How's the honeymoon?" Mrs. Morgan, "You getting used to those wrinkles yet?" Attached was a photo of her at the altar, eyes red-rimmed and lost, captioned with laughing emojis and a hashtag "Mosh and Grace on the Market." She tried to breathe through the embarrassment, the shame, the white-hot flare of anger. It wasn't just the people in the pews who judged her now. It was anyone with a screen, anyone who wanted to watch the town's latest tragedy from a safe distance. In another group chat, a classmate posted a poll. "How long before she bails?" Underneath, someone replied, "She's stuck. Her dad would lose the house. You'd be surprised what girls will do for a mortgage." There were memes made of her gifts of brides running crude jokes about Leonard's age and speculation about her wedding night, each comment sharpening her loneliness like a blade. Grace stood abruptly, the key in her hand, its metal cool and oddly comforting. She pressed it against her palm until it left a mark. She would not cry, not here, not in this house, not where someone might hear. Instead, she did what she had done since childhood. When the world became too much, she looked for something real, something solid. She went to the window, watching as neighbors pretended not to notice her, though she could feel their eyes from behind curtains. The humiliation burned in her chest. The journal called to her. She opened it again, seeking an anchor in the swirl of grief and anger. A new page began with a simple dedication for the one who dares to remember what the town forgot. She read on, finding a letter addressed not to a wife, but to a witness, a person chosen not for love, but for the ability to endure. Leonard's words were clear. "You are not here to save me. You are here to remember and to carry what I could not." He described his own isolation, the way townspeople had mocked him, called him names, old, bitter, dangerous, because he refused to look away from the truth. Grace realized with a mixture of awe and dread that she was now walking the same lonely path. The world she had known, Sunday dinners, safe conversations, her mother's quiet affection felt 1,000 miles away. Even the house with its sunlit rooms and sleepy garden seemed to belong to another life. Now she was both prisoner and inheritor, burdened with secrets that could destroy families, including her own. She thought about calling her mother, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? Did you know about Dad? Did you agree to this marriage? She imagined her mother's trembling voice, the tired assurances that everything would be all right. But Grace knew better. There was no comfort to be found in old lies. The phone buzzed again, and she turned it over face down. Let the world talk, she thought. Let them laugh. She had something they did not, a key, a journal, and the truth. Later, as afternoon shadows stretched across the floor, the mail arrived with a heavy thunk. Grace collected it, expecting bills and advertisements. But in the stack, she found a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a photograph, her father shaking hands with the sheriff in front of the courthouse. Both men grinning, a headline reading, Cedar Falls Unites for Progress. In red pen, someone had underlined her father's name and written, not all who smile are innocent. Some just hide it better. She stared at the photo, her breath coming fast. It was another piece of the puzzle, another crack in the foundation of her life. Evening crept in the sky, bruised with purple and gold. Grace sat in the quiet, her phone now silent, the shadows lengthening. She opened the journal once more, reading about the other outcasts of Cedar Falls. Mothers who lost children, men who vanished after speaking up, lives erased because they threatened the status quo. She wondered how many people walked the streets of her town haunted by what they could not say. In that darkness, her isolation became something different, a stubborn kind of strength. She thought of Leonard, so sure of his task, so deliberate in his silence. Maybe she realized isolation was not the absence of others, but the beginning of a voice that would not be quieted. She looked at the key, then at the attic stairs, barely visible through the cracked parlor door. She was no longer sure what she believed about her family, her marriage, or herself. But she knew that whatever waited in the shadows of this old house, whatever truths had been buried in Cedar Falls, she could no longer turn away. The time for innocence had passed. The only way forward was through. As the house settled and the world outside drifted into night, Grace stood and walked slowly to the bottom of the attic stairs. The key was warm in her hand, her heart pounding, steady and clear. Tomorrow she would find out what secrets waited above her head. Tonight she let herself feel the loneliness, the weight of the town's scorn, and the first small flicker of courage. Somewhere in the darkness, the promise of truth was beginning to shine. Grace Taylor stood at the foot of the attic stairs as dawn broke over Cedar Falls. The old house, still heavy with the residue of last night's storms, felt even more foreign now, every shadow on the wall, a warning, every creak beneath her feet, a reminder that she was trespassing on someone else's memories. In her palm, the small iron key warmed with her pulse, the tag labeled Attic, Box 7 catching the early light that slid through a dirty window. The battered journal pressed tight against her chest. She took a breath and began her climb the steps, groaning beneath her weight as if protesting each decision that had brought her here. At the top, Grace hesitated. The trapdoor was clouded with years of dust and the sticky residue of old cobwebs. She wrapped her fingers in the sleeve of her nightgown and pulled. The lock squealed in protest before giving way with a reluctant pop, the sound echoing through the silent house, like the snap of a long-kept secret. A chill rushed down the stairs as she peered upward, flashlight in hand, the beam slicing through the darkness to reveal piles of boxes, trunks, and yellowing newspapers arranged in precarious stacks. The air up here was thick with the smell of mildew, old wood, and something metallic she could not name. Grace's heart pounded with each step as she moved carefully across the creaking floorboards, her light trembling over faded quilts and broken lamps, a child's forgotten toy, an American flag folded neatly in a corner. The attic seemed frozen in time, a mausoleum for a family's hidden history. And in the center, shrouded with a piece of black velvet, sat a heavy iron chest, larger than she'd expected, its sides etched with rust and scrawled in faded chalk. Do not open if you want peace. For a moment, Grace wanted nothing more than to heed that warning, to go back down the stairs and pretend none of this was hers. But the memory of her father's name in the journal and the sting of the town's mockery kept her rooted. She reached out her hands, shaking, and peeled away the velvet. The iron chest bore an ancient padlock already unfastened, as if waiting for her all these years. She opened it slowly, the hinges moaning, and was greeted by the sight of 6 leather-bound files, each tied with twine, their labels handwritten in Leonard's careful script. She knelt, lifting the files one by one. Sheriff Allen, 1983. Councilman Hurst, 1987. Mayor Linton, 1992. And then, trembling, Samuel Taylor, 1997. Her father's name again, glaring in the gloom. Each file bulged with photographs, faces of missing women and children, faded snapshots of protests, handwritten dates and addresses pinned to the edges. Some images were so old their colors had bled into sepia, but others were more recent victims she remembered from town gossip or whose mothers she'd seen in the supermarket, always alone. Tucked beneath the files, Grace found a stack of cassette tapes, each in a plastic bag, each labeled with a name and date. One read Elise Warren May, 1986, last known recording. Another meeting, Allen Hurst Taylor, Willow Street, 1997. Her hand hovered over the tape marked with her father's name. She could not bring herself to listen, not yet. Instead, she reached for a manila envelope resting beneath the tapes. Its flap was brittle yellowed from years of disuse. Inside, she discovered a photograph so unexpected, her breath left her body in a sharp gasp. It showed a little girl with double-braided hair and bright, searching eyes standing in front of a motel painted turquoise, a sign above her head reading Sunset Inn. On the back, in Leonard's distinctive hand, Rebecca Taylor, 1994. But Grace had never seen this child before. She flipped the photo again, reading and rereading the inscription, her mind racing. Beneath the picture was a copy of a DNA request form, the names Leonard J. Morgan and Rebecca Taylor typed at the top. There was no result attached, only a handwritten note. If you found this, keep going. The answer is not here. It's in the story of the one erased. Confusion twisted through Grace. Her mother had always insisted she was an only child, that their small family had been forged by love and loss after her father's long illness. But this picture, this document, suggested a sister she never knew. And if the story Leonard had written in the journal was true, that sister had not simply disappeared, she had been deliberately erased from the town's memory. Grace's thoughts whirled with questions. Who was Rebecca? Why was Leonard investigating her? And what did it mean that her own family might be at the heart of Cedar Falls' deepest wounds? She tried to remember moments from her childhood, whispers in the hallway, closed doors, the way her mother would flinch at certain songs or names. Had there always been a gap, a space where someone should have been? With trembling hands, she turned back to the files, searching for clues. The documents painted a damning portrait: meetings behind closed doors, bribes exchanged, police reports rewritten or destroyed. There were transcripts of conversations in which town leaders spoke of protecting the legacy, of ensuring the Taylor name stayed clean. One page in particular made Grace's blood run cold. It was a transcript of a meeting between her father, the sheriff, and the mayor. If she keeps digging, we'll make sure she disappears too, one voice said. The reply, don't worry. Nobody will believe her over us. She's just a child. She set the paper down, her vision blurring with sudden tears. All her life, Grace had clung to the stories of Cedar Falls, its pride, its traditions, its sense of safety. Now in the dim attic, surrounded by proof of her family's complicity, she felt those foundations crack. She wanted to scream, but instead she pressed the journal to her heart, drawing strength from the legacy Leonard had forced into her hands. A sudden noise startled her, the wind slamming a shutter, or perhaps just the old house shifting in the heat. But it felt for a moment as if the past itself was stirring. She knew she could not stay in this attic forever, could not clutch these secrets without doing something. Carefully, she gathered the files and the cassette tapes, tucking them under her arm. The photograph of Rebecca, her unknown sister, she placed inside the journal, a new symbol to carry with her. Descending the attic stairs was harder than climbing them. Every step echoed her newfound knowledge, the burden of what she must now do. In the hallway, light from the kitchen caught the edge of a family photo. She stopped, studied it, her father in his councilman sash, her mother in pearls, Grace herself in a dress she barely remembered. There was space on the edge of the frame, as if someone had been cropped out or simply vanished. She made her way to the porch, the air outside thick and buzzing with cicadas. The town stretched before her, innocent in its sleepiness, dangerous in its silence. She sat on the steps, the files spread around her, like the scattered leaves of autumn, the journal open on her lap. Leonard appeared quietly beside her, a cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You saw what was up there, didn't you?" he asked, voice gentle but unyielding. Grace nodded, her own voice a whisper. "Why me? Why give this to me?" He took a slow sip, then said, "Because you're the only one who hasn't turned away. I tried to leave these stories behind, but the town wouldn't let me, and neither will you, not now." Grace let the morning breeze cool her face, the ache in her chest replaced by a grim sense of purpose. She looked at the photograph of the girl she had never known, her own eyes, staring back from another face. It was not just her family's history she carried now. It was the burden of a community and the hope that someone, somewhere might finally listen. In the hush of the porch, as the day brightened and the world came alive, Grace understood the truth. Some attics hold more than dust and old boxes. Some are filled with the weight of lives lost, stories stolen, and secrets begging to be set free. Grace had always imagined that facing her past would be like stepping onto a battlefield. Noisy, crowded, the truth, cutting through the lies in one swift moment. But when she drove across Cedar Falls to her mother's small house on Magnolia Lane, the streets were quiet, almost peaceful. Old maples arched overhead, filtering sunlight across the cracked sidewalk. But Grace's hands shook on the steering wheel, and her heart pounded with the memory of everything she'd uncovered in Leonard's attic, the files, the tapes, the photograph of the little girl named Rebecca Taylor, her own sister hidden away by silence and fear. She parked and walked up the steps, clutching the folder of evidence to her chest. The door opened before she could knock. Her mother, Elaine Taylor, stood framed in the entryway, her apron dusted with flour, her face older than Grace remembered. "Back so soon?" Elaine asked, trying for a smile that never reached her eyes. Grace didn't answer. She stepped past her mother, placing the folder on the kitchen table with trembling hands. "I need you to tell me about Rebecca," she said, her voice brittle, barely more than a whisper. Elaine's hands froze, clutching the apron like a lifeline. "We don't talk about that," she said softly. "It's too late, Grace." But Grace couldn't be silenced now. She opened the folder, spreading out the photographs and documents, letting the morning light reveal every painful truth. "You lied to me. My whole life you said I was an only child, that Dad was a hero, but you both hid her. Why did you let this town erase her?" For a long moment, her mother just stared at the table, eyes shimmering with tears. The only sounds were the ticking clock and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Finally, Elaine sat down, her shoulders crumpling beneath the weight of decades. "After the fire at the motel, they said it was an accident. But I always knew she was taken. Leonard tried to warn me, but your father, he said it was too dangerous to question the sheriff, the mayor. We'd lose everything if we made noise. He made me promise never to speak her name again." Grace felt anger and heartbreak tangle in her chest. "You let them turn her into a ghost," she said, her voice shaking. "And you let them do the same to me." Elaine's tears finally spilled over. "I thought I was protecting you, Grace. I was so afraid." "But you can't protect anyone with silence," Grace replied. She gathered the evidence and stood. "I have to find her. I have to tell the truth, even if it means losing everything." Her mother's silence was her answer. Grace left the house, her resolve hardened. She drove straight to Leonard's, the files on the passenger seat, the photo of Rebecca pressed against her heart. Leonard was waiting on the porch, a thermos of tea at his side. He said nothing as she approached, only nodded, once the deep lines of his face softening for the briefest moment. "I know what I have to do," Grace told him. "You said the final answer wasn't in the attic. It's out there in the story that's never been told. But I can't do it alone." Leonard pushed a small envelope across the table. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "I've been holding on to this for years, a name, an address, someone you should meet." Inside was a photograph of a young woman with familiar eyes standing outside a small bookshop 2 towns away. On the back, in Leonard's handwriting, Rebecca Taylor, now known as Anna Reed. Grace felt her world tilt again. She drove the 60 miles to Pine Grove, the journal, and key tucked in her bag, her mind racing with hope and fear. The bookshop was quiet, its windows full of faded paperbacks and hand-lettered signs. Grace hesitated on the threshold, but as she stepped inside, a bell rang softly and the woman behind the counter looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. Grace saw her own face reflected back, similar jaw, the same stubborn glint in her eyes. "Anna," she whispered. The woman blinked, stepping around the counter. She reached for the photograph. Grace held her hands trembling. "I always knew I was missing something," Anna said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I never thought my own family would find me." In that moment, the silence of Cedar Falls was broken, not by violence or scandal, but by two sisters finally seeing each other, finally letting themselves be known. They talked for hours, piecing together what had been taken from them. Childhood's lost memories erased the hope that somehow telling their story could make a difference. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Falls, the reckoning had begun. An anonymous envelope arrived at the newsroom of the Cedar Falls Tribune. Inside were copies of Leonard's files, the audio tapes, the photographs, proof of decades of corruption of stories hidden by the powerful. Included was a letter signed Grace Taylor, daughter, sister, witness. The story went live within hours, the headlines blaring across town. Cedar Falls' darkest secrets exposed. Social media exploded, hashtags trending statewide. Chashin justice for Rebecca Dewey, Cedar Falls truth. At first, some in the community reacted with denial, anger, even ridicule. But as evidence mounted and the tapes circulated, denial gave way to shame. The old jokes about Grace disappeared, replaced by messages of support, apologies from old classmates, and even a few public officials stepping down. Grace's phone, once a source of pain, became a lifeline. Reporters, activists, even people from nearby towns wanting to help. The most surprising response came from the very people who had once laughed at her. The same neighbors who had snapped her photo at the wedding now brought casseroles to her porch, their children drawing signs that read, "We believe you." And when Grace and Anna walked together down Main Street, people parted to let them pass, not in judgment, but in silent respect. Leonard watched all of this from his porch, a quiet satisfaction on his face. When Grace visited him one last time, she found him seated at his old piano, a sheet of music open, his hands resting gently on the keys. "I didn't do this for thanks," he told her quietly. "I just wanted someone to remember. You gave me back my family," Grace said, the weight of gratitude nearly breaking her voice, "and you gave this town a chance to heal." Leonard smiled, his eyes shining. "Then you know what to do next." The days that followed were filled with new beginnings. A memorial was established for the missing and the lost Rebecca's name, and the names of others erased from the records etched in granite on the courthouse lawn. Grace helped launch a scholarship for local students in Anna's name, for those who speak the truth even when no one listens. The journal and key found a new home in the town's library, where anyone could read the stories that had once been buried. Anna, too, found purpose in her new life. She stayed in Pine Grove, but visited Cedar Falls, often standing beside her sister, as the town slowly, painfully learned to remember. A week later, Leonard passed away quietly, his hands folded over the journal he had started so many years ago. At his funeral, the church was filled with people who owed him more than they could ever say: survivors, families, neighbors, and a new generation determined never to let silence win again. As the seasons changed and the town grew, Grace sometimes walked the path to Leonard's old house, sitting on the porch with Anna, the two of them watching fireflies rise over the fields. The past could not be undone, but the legacy of courage, truth, and family endured. One evening, Grace unlocked the display case in the library, running her fingers over the battered journal, the small iron key. She thought of everything they had lost and everything they had found. Above the courthouse, the old flag flapped in a gentle wind. For the first time in a long time, Cedar Falls felt like a place where secrets could no longer hide, and where hope at last was free to grow.